What if I told you that most men don't realize they're being punished until the damage is already done? Not with anger, not with shouting, but with silence, distance, emotional disappearance. Today we're solving one deep psychological problem: why women punish men in ways that confuse, haunt, and emotionally destabilize them, and how understanding this can change relationships forever. Most people believe punishment is a decision, a conscious act, a calculated move designed to hurt. But when it comes to how women punish men, this belief collapses almost instantly. Because in reality, the punishment usually begins long before the woman herself understands what she's doing. Imagine this. Nothing dramatic happened. No shouting. No breakup. No obvious betrayal. And yet, something inside her shifted. Her tone changed. Her warmth faded. Her availability shrank. To the man, it feels sudden, unfair, confusing. But to her nervous system, it feels automatic. This is the first truth most people miss. Punishment is often emotional, not conscious. Women don't wake up thinking, "Today I'll punish him." What happens instead is far more subtle and far more psychological. An emotional alarm goes off. Something felt dismissive. Something felt like abandonment, disrespect, or invisibility. And the body reacts before the mind catches up. At that moment, logic exits the room. The brain shifts from connection mode into protection mode, and protection doesn't ask permission. Protection doesn't explain itself, it simply acts. This is why punishment can look disproportionate. A small comment triggers a massive withdrawal. A missed call leads to emotional distance. A repeated pattern of neglect results in sudden coldness. The man focuses on the event. The woman is reacting to the accumulated emotional weight behind it. Her emotions are not reacting to what just happened. They are responding to what it reminded her of. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Women are generally socialized to suppress direct aggression, to stay composed, to not explode, to not appear too emotional. So instead of outward confrontation, the emotional response turns inward and sideways. It leaks through behavior, silence, distance, reduced affection, short answers, delayed replies. From the outside, it looks intentional. From the inside, it feels necessary. Because when a woman feels emotionally unsafe, closeness becomes dangerous, vulnerability becomes a liability, and punishment becomes the subconscious language of self-defense. This is not about control, it's about regulation. Her nervous system is trying to stabilize itself. And one of the fastest ways to do that is to reduce emotional exposure to the source of pain. The man isn't being attacked, he's being distanced. Men often interpret this as manipulation because they assume intention. But intention requires clarity. And most women in this state are emotionally overwhelmed, not strategically planning. This is why asking, "Why are you doing this to me?" often gets no answer, because she doesn't fully know. She only knows how she feels, and feelings don't come with instruction manuals. The punishment isn't designed to hurt the man, it's designed to stop the hurt inside her. That distinction changes everything. Think about how often men demand explanations during emotional conflict. They want logic, timelines, evidence, reason. But the reaction didn't originate in logic, it originated in emotion. And emotion doesn't respond to interrogation, it responds to safety. This is why punishment escalates when men become defensive. Defensiveness confirms the original threat. It tells her nervous system, "You are not safe to express this." So the withdrawal deepens. The walls rise higher. The emotional distance grows colder. And the man feels punished even more, not because she wants power, but because her system is screaming for protection. The most dangerous misunderstanding is believing that punishment equals malice. In most cases, it equals fear. Fear of being unheard. Fear of being dismissed, fear of repeating old emotional wins. When you understand this, you start seeing punishment not as an attack but as a signal that something emotional broke long before the behavior changed, a signal that connection was lost before distance appeared, a signal that the pain was real, even if the response feels unfair. And once you see punishment as an unconscious emotional response rather than a conscious act of cruelty, the entire dynamic shifts, because you stop asking, "How do I stop her from punishing me?" and start asking, what made her feel unsafe enough to protect herself this way? Power is one of the most misunderstood forces in human relationships. People assume power only exists in dominance, authority, or control. But in emotional dynamics, power shows up in far quieter, subtler ways, especially when it feels lost, especially when it feels taken, and especially when it feels denied. When a woman feels powerless in a relationship, punishment doesn't appear as revenge. It appears as balance. This is where Keynote 2's power shifts create punishment. Powerlessness doesn't always come from obvious abuse or betrayal. Sometimes it's born from being repeatedly talked over, from emotional needs being minimized, from promises that dissolve into patterns of neglect, from giving more than receiving and slowly realizing that effort isn't being matched. At first, many women respond by trying harder. They explain more clearly. They adjust themselves. They compromise. They wait. But every unmet emotional need quietly erodes their sense of agency. And when agency disappears, the psyche searches for a way to restore it. Punishment becomes that way, not consciously, not maliciously, but psychologically. When a woman feels she has no influence through open communication, she turns to influence through withdrawal. When her voice feels ineffective, her absence becomes louder. This is the moment power shifts. Men often don't recognize this shift because it doesn't look like power. It looks like distance, it looks like coldness, it looks like emotional shutdown. But distance is not emptiness. Distance is leverage. By pulling back, she reclaims control over access to herself. Her time, her energy, her emotional presence. Things she may have once given freely now become restricted. Not to punish in a sadistic sense, but to rebalance an emotional scale that feels tilted against her. This is why punishment often follows moments where a woman felt ignored or dismissed. The internal message she receives is simple, I don't matter here. And the internal response is equally simple. Then I will remove what I bring. This is not about hurting him, it's about restoring dignity. Powerlessness triggers a deep psychological discomfort. Humans are wired to resist it. When direct power is unavailable, indirect power emerges. Silence replaces confrontation. Distance replaces argument. Emotional withholding replaces pleading. And here's where it gets complex. Men often experience this as unfair. They feel blindsided, they feel controlled. But from her internal perspective, she finally feels like she has breathing room, space, autonomy, a sense of control she lost by overgiving. This is especially common in relationships where women feel emotionally responsible for maintaining harmony. When they carry the emotional labor, when they monitor moods, when they adjust themselves to keep things smooth. Over time, this creates exhaustion, and exhaustion breeds resentment, and resentment looks for release. Punishment becomes a psychological equalizer, not because she wants to dominate, but because she wants to stop feeling dominated by neglect, inconsistency, or emotional unpredictability. The power shift also explains why punishment often intensifies when men try to regain control forcefully, demanding explanations, pressuring for closeness, accusing her of playing games. All of this reinforces the original imbalance. It tells her that her autonomy is still being threatened. So the withdrawal deepens, the punishment hardens. From the outside, it looks like escalation. From the inside, it feels like self-defense. This dynamic is rooted in a very old psychological principle. When people feel powerless, they seek any available method to restore control over their environment. In relationships, the most immediate environment is emotional access. And the fastest way to regain control over that is to limit it. This is why punishment often comes without warning. Because the internal power struggle has been happening silently for a long time. By the time behavior changes, the emotional decision was already made. Men often ask, why didn't she just tell me? But powerlessness doesn't feel safe enough for honesty. Honesty requires confidence that one's voice matters. When that confidence erodes, behavior speaks instead. Understanding this doesn't mean agreeing with the punishment. It means recognizing the psychological function it serves. It is an attempt to reclaim self-worth, to restore balance, to feel like an active participant rather than a passive emotional resource. And until that sense of power is addressed, punishment remains the language through which control is quietly taken back. There is a reason silence cuts deeper than words. Words can be argued with. Words can be defended against. Words can be dismissed. Silence offers no such escape. It creates a psychological vacuum, and the human mind is wired to panic inside empty spaces. This is why silence hurts more than confrontation. When a woman confronts a man, she is still emotionally present. She is still invested. She is still willing to risk vulnerability by expressing disappointment, anger, or pain. Confrontation, no matter how uncomfortable, is an attempt to repair connection. Silence is something else entirely. Silence is what happens when speaking no longer feels safe or effective. Men often misinterpret silence as immaturity or manipulation. But psychologically, silence is a withdrawal of emotional energy. And emotional energy is the core currency of connection. When it is removed, the relationship enters a state of deprivation. The mind reacts to this deprivation instantly. Uncertainty replaces clarity. Anxiety replaces confidence. The unanswered questions become louder than any argument ever could. What did I do wrong? Is she done? Does she still care? Am I losing her? Silence forces the man to confront his own thoughts without guidance, and the mind rarely chooses comforting explanations. This is why silence feels like punishment even when no explicit punishment was intended. From the woman's perspective, silence often begins as self-protection. After repeated attempts to explain herself, she reaches a point where speaking feels useless. The emotional cost of confrontation outweighs the potential benefit, so the nervous system chooses the safer option, retreat. This retreat is not empty. It is full of unspoken emotions: hurt, disappointment, resentment, grief. Silence becomes the container that holds everything she can no longer articulate without feeling dismissed or invalidated. And here is the paradox. Silence feels calm on the outside, but it is emotionally heavy on the inside. Maintaining silence requires effort. It is not passive. It is an active decision to withhold expression, not because she doesn't feel, but because she feels too much. Men often try to break the silence by pushing harder, asking repeatedly, demanding clarity, accusing her of being cold. But pressure does not create safety. Pressure confirms why silence felt necessary in the first place, so the withdrawal deepens. The power of silence lies in its ambiguity. It removes emotional cues, no reassurance, no anger, no warmth, just absence. And absence forces reflection. Sometimes it forces regret. Sometimes it forces panic. Sometimes it forces realization. This is why silence is often used when confrontation has failed, because silence shifts the emotional burden. Instead of her carrying the pain through explanation, he carries it through uncertainty. But it's important to understand that silence is not always meant to teach a lesson. Often, it is meant to stop further injury. When a woman goes silent, she is closing a wound before it becomes infected by more misunderstanding. The danger of silence is that it can easily become permanent. Temporary silence can be a pause. Extended silence becomes a detachment. Emotional distance, once normalized, is difficult to reverse. Men sometimes mistake silence as space that will eventually close on its own. But silence creates a new emotional rhythm. And if that rhythm stabilizes without him, reconnection becomes harder. This is why silence feels so final, because it carries the potential of emotional extinction. It suggests a future where his presence is no longer necessary to her emotional stability. Silence also allows a woman to observe, to see how a man responds when access is removed. Does he reflect? Does he take responsibility? Does he reach out with empathy? Or does he become defensive, angry, or dismissive? In this way, silence becomes information. It reveals character without confrontation. The most painful aspect of silence is that it removes the illusion of control. Words can be negotiated. Silence cannot. You cannot argue with absence. You can only respond to it. And that response often determines whether the silence breaks or hardens. Most people think punishment is about pain, about getting even, about making the other person suffer. But psychologically, punishment is rarely about damage. It is about delivery. It is a message wrapped in behavior when words no longer feel powerful enough to carry it. Punishment is communication in disguise. When a woman punishes a man, what she is often doing is translating an emotional truth she feels unable to say out loud. Not because she lacks the words, but because she believes the words will not land. She has already tried speaking. She has already explained. She has already softened her tone, chosen her language carefully, and hoped for understanding. When that fails, behavior takes over. Behavior never argues. Behavior demonstrates. Silence communicates exhaustion. Distance communicates disappointment. Withdrawal communicates fear. Indifference communicates emotional resignation. Each action carries meaning, even if the recipient struggles to interpret it. Men often ask, "Why didn't she just tell me?" But this question assumes communication is a single event. In reality, communication is cumulative. By the time punishment appears, the message has usually been sent many times in quieter ways. The punishment is not the first sentence, it is the final paragraph. This is where misunderstanding becomes inevitable. Men are often trained to look for direct statements, clear complaints, explicit boundaries, but emotional communication doesn't always work that way. When feelings are dismissed, minimized, or rationalized away, they find another outlet. Punishment becomes the language that cannot be interrupted. This is why punishment feels unfair, because it often arrives without explanation. But from her internal perspective, the explanation has already been given. It just wasn't received. Punishment as communication is not about revenge. It is about visibility. It is the psyche saying, "Seal this, understand this." When emotional pain remains unseen, it intensifies. When it intensifies enough, it externalizes through action. There is also a protective layer beneath this communication. Directly stating pain requires vulnerability. Vulnerability risks dismissal. Punishment, on the other hand, creates distance. It reduces exposure. It allows her to express pain without standing emotionally naked in front of someone who has previously failed to protect it. This is why punishment can feel cold, because it is safer than warmth in a hostile emotional environment. Men often respond to punishment with logic. They analyze behavior, they demand reasons, they try to negotiate access. But logic does not decode emotional language. Empathy does. And without empathy, the message remains encrypted. Punishment also functions as a test, though rarely a conscious one. Not a test of obedience, but a test of awareness. Will he notice the shift? Will he reflect without being told? Will he recognize the pain behind the behavior? Or will he focus only on how the behavior affects him? The response determines whether communication continues or shuts down completely. Another critical aspect is that punishment often emerges when a woman feels emotionally alone in a relationship, when she feels like she has been carrying the emotional load by herself. In that state, speaking feels like labor. Punishment becomes the quiet resignation of someone who is tired of explaining their humanity. This doesn't mean punishment is healthy. It means it is meaningful. Ignoring the message behind it ensures repetition. Understanding the message creates the possibility of repair. The tragedy is that punishment often escalates because it is misread. Men see hostility where there is hurt, control where there is fear, games where there is grief. Each misinterpretation pushes her further into silence, deeper into distance, more committed to withdrawal. Punishment persists until the message is acknowledged, not argued with, not dismissed, acknowledged. Because once someone feels truly seen, the need to speak through pain dissolves. And at the core of every punishment disguised as behavior is a single unmet plea trying to be heard without having to. If we pull everything together, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Women do not punish men because they are cruel, manipulative, or emotionally unstable. They punish when something vital breaks inside the connection and no safer language remains. What men experience as punishment is often the visible surface of invisible damage, emotional reactions that were never acknowledged, power imbalances that were never corrected, silence that grew because words stopped working, messages that were sent again and again but never truly received. This is why punishment feels confusing, because it is not born in the moment it appears. It is born much earlier, in small dismissals, unmet needs, and repeated emotional disconnects. By the time behavior changes, the emotional decision has already been made. Understanding this doesn't mean excusing hurtful behavior. It means decoding it. Because once punishment is understood as emotional communication, self-protection, and an attempt to restore balance, the entire dynamic shifts. You stop reacting to the behavior and start responding to the cause. For men, this awareness creates power. Not power over women, but power over the outcome. The ability to listen without defensiveness, to respond with empathy instead of logic, to recognize emotional withdrawal as a warning sign, not a personal attack. For women, being understood reduces the need to punish at all. When emotional safety is restored, behavior softens naturally. Silence no longer feels necessary. Distance no longer feels protective. The real problem this script set out to solve was never, why do women punish men? The real problem was why emotional pain is so often misread until it turns into distance. Because in the end, punishment is not the opposite of love. Indifference is. And long before indifference arrives, there is always a chance to listen, to see, and to repair what was quietly breaking.